In this video, we'll discuss policy structure and terms. A policy is one or more rules that are grouped together that are designed to either accept routing information that enters into your router or to reject information that's entering into the router. Now, these policies can also be used to control what routing information is exported out of your router as well. Now, these policies are created in what we call a policy language. Now, this policy language is similar to other programming languages in the sense that they do act as kind of like if statements that's found in other programming languages. These policies are divided up into little sections or modules, and there's a lot of similar parsing rules, such as we do have curly brackets to denote different sections of the policy, and we also have semicolons to end statements. So this is how a policy works. What you're seeing on the slide here is one big policy. Actually, this section here is one big policy. So a policy is made up of one or more policy statements. So here I have a policy statement, here I have a policy statement, and here I have a policy statement. Now what happens is that information flows into your router. So the routing information comes in, and it executes the first policy statement that exists in the policy. Now, when this policy statement executes, it's a test of criteria. And what happens is that the policy is designed with what we call action. So after the policy statement, you have an action kick in to either accept the information based off the criteria of the policy or to reject the information. Now, when information comes in, let's say I create a policy that says, if it's OSPF information, right? So I create a policy that says if it's OSPF information, then accept the routing information into our router. Now let's say a RIP message comes into the router. It's not OSPF information, so the first policy statement doesn't kick in with an accept or a reject, so the information flows to the next policy statement, right? And then the next rule will kick in, and it'll either accept or reject. And again, if an accept or reject is not found, then it'll go to the next policy statement. So it's important to know that the information will flow through multiple policy statements within the policy until one of the actions is found of either accept or reject. Accept and reject are what are known as terminating actions. They kind of end the process, right? So if I built that policy statement that said if it's OSPF information, then accept it. When routing information comes in to the router, right? So it comes in here, the policy statement executes, says, is it OSPF information? Oh, it is. So we're going to go and accept the information. So at that point, it adds it to the routing table and eventually, makes it to the forwarding table. So that's kind of the idea of the routing policy and the fact that the routing policy has multiple statements. Now, one more thing I want to throw at you is these policy statements are what are known as terms. So realistically, a policy is made up of one or more terms, and those terms have resulting actions of either accept or reject. So we saw that you can create a policy with multiple policy statements or multiple terms in them, and when the information flows into your router, it'll go through each of these policy statements, the first one, the second one, the third one, unless the first one has a terminating action of either accept or reject, right? If it doesn't, it'll go to the next policy statement, the next policy statement. Now, what's important is at the end of the line, what if there's no criteria that matches the information that's coming in, right? After the third policy statement, what happens? Well, there is default policies that exist. Now, a lot of people ask, what is the default policy? But it's important to note that each protocol has different default policies in place. And these default policies also depend on whether we're talking about importing or exporting. So importing is when information comes into your router. Exporting is when your router advertises routing information out. So there's different default policies depending on whether we're talking about import or export. So as an example, the OSPF protocol and the RIP routing protocol have a default import policy of accept, but they have a default export policy of reject everything. So nothing's going out by default. So the default action really depends on what protocol are we talking about, and are we talking about an import or an export. So the last thing I want to talk about here is terms. And as I mentioned earlier, those policy statements are what we call terms. So terms are segments of the policy. They're designed to match routes to user-specific criteria. So you design those terms and you program those current terms based off the criteria that you're looking for. Those terms also perform specific actions once a match is made. So as I mentioned, you could create a term that says if the information is OSPF information, then we want to accept the route information. So accept would be the action in that case, but we can also go and reject the information. Also, what's important about policy terms is that you can use a single policy term, you can use multiple policy terms, or else you can create a policy that uses no policy terms as well. So in this video, we discuss policy structure and terms.